Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Christus ist mein Leben, which translates to Christ is my life. This is an interesting chorale. I mean, just visually speaking, you're probably gravitating towards this part right here, which is very unusual. I would describe what's going on here as not chorale-like. Definitely feels like there's like a hybridization of different vocal musical styles in this particular chorale setting, but it mostly has a harmonic rhythm and the melody is mostly harmonized here. But we're going to talk about this part and what I think is going on here when we get to it. Other than that, it's fairly straightforward to analyze. We start with 1 sharp in the key signature, G major at the end as well. So I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is G major. And then we move to another G major chord, G, D, G, and B, so we don't need to reanalyze. And then we have D, D, F sharp, and A, which is a 5 chord, D major. And then we move to another G major chord, G, D, G, and B, which is our tonic triad. This F sharp here is a passing 7th, and then we have E, C, G, and C, which is C major in first inversion, or 4/6. And then we have G major in first inversion, B, B, G, and D, which is 1/6. This C is a passing tone. And then we have D, D, G, D, B, G, and D, which is kind of like taking our tonic triad and putting it in second inversion, and this F sharp and this A right here, where I guess we could just put the 5 chord here. I think really what's happening here is that this F sharp and this A are both I guess foreshadowing what's going to happen on the next beat, because this E is also a non-chord tone, and then we get like a precursor to the cadence right here on the last beat before the next measure. So the 1/6/4 going to the 5 I guess technically happens here, but it feels more so like it's happening on this last beat here. And then our faux imperfect authentic cadence is here, where we cadence on G major, G, G, D, and B. There are no, I didn't forget to add fermatas in my score. There aren't fermatas in the score, supposedly. So the cadences that we hear, generally speaking, are marked before a rest, at least in the first system. But you just sort of have to hear them. All right, so now we're moving on to the second phrase. So we have a really interesting profile here. Definitely something that I would say is just inherently not chorale-like. It looks like fourth species counterpoint more than anything else. But what's interesting about it is the fact that I do believe it's analyzable. We do have enough context in order to make some deductions about what's going on harmonically speaking, but all in all, I think there is a bit of a quick cadence that happens here right before the end of this measure here on the second beat, and I do believe it's a half cadence in the key of G. And I think with all of the chromaticism going on here, there's an argument to be made about the fact that this might be a slight departure from the key of G major to the key of A minor. There's a lot of real estate spent on it. The fact that there are 2 chromatic tones that are introduced that are A minor like here kind of is an argument for that, but I suppose you could make an argument that we're just tonicizing A minor here. To me, the more that I listen to it, the more it sounds like we've moved to the key of A minor. So I'm just going to say that this E right here is beginning the idea of A minor. It's the 5th of the chord, and I'm going to put it in parentheses because the entire chord isn't implied here, and this is just theory at this point. But in the key of G major, A minor is our 2 chord, and in the key of A minor is our 1 chord. And I think this is going to be significant as a modulation point later on as well. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but it's a pretty convenient coincidence for being justified by what's going to happen later in the last phrase. Then we get F natural. So F natural under E, it's really, we're kind of limited in terms of what chord we can analyze here. Really, I don't think there's a lot of chordal analysis going on here. Just Bach is introducing and layering tones. He spends this time sort of cascading sevenths here. He starts with a major seventh, he goes to a diminished seventh, and then he goes to a augmented fifth, which, harmonically speaking, we're never getting an individual chord, but I think we can infer that there's some implied harmony here. So when we get the F, a variety of things could be happening here, right? It could be a 4 chord, it could be a 6 chord, it could be a 2 chord. We honestly don't know. I'm going to hedge my bets and say that it is a 6 chord though, only because of the fact that F and E are occurring at the same time, and that would more specifically make it an F major 7 chord, so 6, 7, but we don't know too much about it. These suspensions could be largely just false indications about what harmony is going on at the triadic level. But afterwards, this G sharp and this D, actually along with this F here, does give us a G sharp fully diminished 7th chord, and I do think that that's pretty much what's being implied here. But what ends up happening is that this extra beat here, or this extra measure where C gets introduced, we have C, G sharp, F, and D. It's kind of like a D minor 7 with a flat 5, or I guess it's technically a sharp 4. But if we saw this chord, I don't really know what I'd do in terms of making ends of it, because it just doesn't quite make a ton of sense. I feel like it's just a crunchy tone. Like I would expect, instead of C here, I would expect B. So maybe this C is a lower suspension, and ultimately it's not really a chord tone, but this B that we resolve to here is our chord tone. But the reason why I think that outlook on what's going on here might be incorrect is because the rest of the chords resolve where we would expect them to here, to 1, 6. So I feel like what the C is doing is just foreshadowing. It's just implying 1, 6 here. We get the C in the bass. It's what's going to be the chord tone moving forward, and I feel like that's what's happening. It's pretty undeniable that that's what's happening here on this beat right here on beat 1 of the penultimate measure of the first system. But the reason why I put it in parentheses is because it really is foreshadowing. The chord that we have here is, like I said, most likely, if I had to redact the rest of this and it was to continue in this same fashion, I would imagine the C would resolve down to B, and this would be just a crunchy G sharp fully diminished 7th chord at some point. But we get A minor afterwards, and then the resolution happens. So maybe this is a suspension where the melody changes before the bass gets to change. Often when we see suspensions in the upper voices, Bach will change the bass to change the effect or the interval that the upper voice resolves to. But here, maybe it's just a switching of roles. Either way, very odd section. I would take the harmonic content here with a grain of salt. At least the first 2 beats, it's kind of speculative. I think ultimately he's sort of building to a diminished chord here, but it's harder to imply chords with just one tone. I am pretty convinced, however, that he's spending more than just a period of time tonicizing A, and that he has moved to A, or I guess more specifically A minor. And this 1/6 chord, I think, just pops us right back into the key of G major, where it's now 2/6. And this is convenient because if you make the argument that he's spending this whole major on, or whole measure on A minor, that 2/6 chord will just function as a predominant, right? D, A, F sharp, and C, which is our 5 chord with the 7th, D7. This B is a little neighbor tone, and then we cadence on the 5/7 chord here. So this B is also a neighbor tone. This A is actually taking the chord and briefly putting it in root position, so I'll mark that. But the harmonic analysis here, really take it with a grain of salt. That's why these videos are really helpful, or at least I think they have the potential to be helpful, because I can really talk about my thought process and articulate the fact that this isn't law, right? This isn't gospel. But I think if you listen to it, there definitely is an implied progression going on. It's just how that progression is harmonized could be different based on the individual. But the latter half of it, this 7/7 chord, I think, is the defining chord of this progression, because it's the only point in the progression where we have a chord that is fully like isolated, that can stand on its own. But regardless, we spend time pointing towards A minor here. I think we move to A, like I said, then we go back to G, and then we spend the end of the phrase in G major. But immediately afterwards, we get a phrase that ends in a half cadence in the key of E minor. So we never get the resolution to G major like we would expect. We actually go to E, G, G, and B, which is E minor. That's our 6th chord. So I do look at this as a deceptive progression. But this ends up just being our gateway to the key of E minor, a 1 chord here. And then we have an anticipation in 2 passing tones, D, B, F sharp, and B, which is kind of interesting because 3 voices are moving here. It does feel like there is a chord progression happening here. And if we do have a chord progression happening here, that would make this subdivided chord here a minor dominant, and it is being subdivided. It is being followed by a chord that would likely follow a minor dominant as well, which is 4/6, C, A, E, and E, A minor in first inversion. But the fact that it's subdivided and not getting its own accented beat means that, you know, again, take it with a grain of salt. It's not as exciting as when you'd find a minor dominant on a strong beat. Sometimes we do, and that's more of an occasion to talk about it. But here, 5/6 in passing, and it's also a byproduct of Bach using natural minor rather than the melody having D natural. My original hypothesis was the majority of minor dominants were not Bach's doing because the third of the chord was in the melody, but here we have clear evidence that that's not the case, and there have been many instances of that not being the case in my past videos as well, which you should check out. But if this was a 4/6 chord, this B would be some type of like 7/6 suspension over the bass. Then this B here would be a non-chord tone as well, before we get C, C, F sharp, and A. I think this F sharp is an accented non-chord tone. I suppose you could analyze this as 2/6/4, but again, you know, when you find second inversion 2 chords in a Phrygian half cadential context, there's usually a 4 chord in close proximity, this being just another testament to that. So I'm just going to keep this analyzed as a 4/6 chord. That's what I feel like it is operating as before we cadence on 5, B, F sharp, D sharp, and B, which is B major. And like I mentioned earlier, this is some type of Phrygian half cadence. And if you don't know what a Phrygian half cadence is, all it means is the bass is moving down by a half step. This flat 6/5 motion, I guess, is compared to the Phrygian mode, which is the really the only mode that gets use, like in Western classical music, that has that flat 2 going to 1 motion between the second and first degrees of the pitch collection. But yeah, it's not super important. It's just something that I'm tracking in comparison to all the half cadences, how many of them are Phrygian half cadences. So just a metric to keep track of. Moving ahead, we have a relatively longer phrase. It ends, I guess, here in an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. I suppose you can make an argument this is a half cadence in the key of G major as well, but it sounds much more imperfect authentic cadence-like because of where the C sharps happen and because the melody feels like it's going from 4 to 1 in the key of D. But you could make the argument it's going from 1 to 5 in the key of G as well. It's fairly negligible of a point, but I think a modulation happens. But speaking of modulations, we do go from B major directly to G major, and this feels like a direct modulation to me, which is interesting because when we're going from E minor to G major, there are loads of ways to create a common chord modulation. Not that that's essential, it's just interesting that we have 2 relative keys that are being modulated between directly rather than through a common chord, which, you know, Bach does with distant keys. So we start off with G major, B, D, G, and D. That's our tonic triad in first inversion. And then we get B, C, G, and E, keeping the bass the same. This is C major 7 over B, and we would expect a third inversion 7 chord to resolve down by step, and the root would move a fifth away, so that we would expect it to go to a 7/6 chord, which it does, A, C, A, and F sharp. That's F sharp diminished. This is pretty much always expected. We do see some 4/2 figures resolve to root position, but that's more of a It's more of a nuanced situation. We have seen it in the past, but the bass still resolves down by step. That's something that the textbook really has down pat. And then we would expect that to resolve to our tonic, G, D, B, and G, which is our tonic triad in root position. This B is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, but it does put our chord in first inversion for a beat before we get D major, D, D, A, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord, and this is where I mark our modulation to the key of D. You would continue to analyze in the key of G if you felt like this was a half cadence in the key of G. But like I said, I feel like this is an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D. So G, D, B, and E, that's E minor 7 over G. You know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords. In the key of G, this would be a 6, 6, 5 chord. This F sharp is a passing tone, this A is a passing tone, and then we get E, D, G, and E. And very similarly to the way that our first cadence looks here with this set of 16th notes happening here on the exact same metric position, I feel like it's really just a precursor to what's happening here. So the chord does briefly get put into root position, E, D, G, and E. It's incomplete. I suppose you could make the argument that this is some type of 7 chord, C sharp, E, G, and E. I don't really feel like that's necessarily the case though, because like these 16th notes are functioning here, they're more so a precursor to what's going to happen next rather than being their own chord, especially because of the fact that they're 16th notes. They're very, very brief in the texture, and I don't think that anything more than an individual chord could be happening here. So we'll just say that the chord is turning into root position, and because there's no fifth in the chord, the figured bass will reflect that. This C sharp is a non-chord tone. This B is a chord tone that's actually filling in the chord, so even though it is a 7-3 chord on the beat, it would be a 7-5-3 chord if we included that B, but it's happening after the chord, so not super important. And we would expect this to go to some type of 5 chord, which it does. A, C sharp, G, and E, which is more specifically 5-7. It's A7. This A is a chord tone, this G is a chord tone, and then we cadence on D major, D, A, F sharp, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. Now, trying to create some symmetry between the first and second systems here, we start off with E minor, E, E, G, and B, which is not our tonic triad, it is our supertonic triad, our 2 chord, but in the key of E minor, it is our 1 chord. And I think it's interesting, formally speaking, that we have a phrase that ends with this very similar looking configuration of rhythms here in the key of D major, not in the key of G major, but rather the key of D major. And if we compare the keys here, and this is what kind of solidified and made me feel like my analysis here was more accurate, we're going from G to A. Here we start in G, but the phrase ultimately ends in D, and that's fine. So we have mid-phrase modulation here. We go to D, and then we go to E. So the relationship between the 2 keys here, one in G and one in A, one in D and one in E, they're a whole step apart. One is the tonic, one is the supertonic, one is the tonic, one is the supertonic. They're also modulating over the same chord. If you can call this E a chord, it's implying a chord for my purposes, but I think it's just too much of a coincidence that these 2 phrases have so much in common from their advent. So all in all, like I said, there's a lot of salt being taken. Lots of grains are just being taken from the salt shaker here, but all in all, I think that there are similarities between the 2 phrases, definitely not in terms of their profile and their rhythm. We do get this long E here, but it does happen before the phrase, so there's not really too much the phrases have in common in terms of the way that they look, but in terms of the way that they start off and the relationship between the 2 phrases, there's actually quite a bit in common there, so some things in common, some things not in common. I'll leave how similar they are up to you to decide. I think they are relatively similar. So after our modulation to E minor, we have a passing 7th in the bass. Then we get clear harmonic minor here in the bass as well. C sharp, E, G, and A. That's A7 over C sharp, and unlike what we saw before, this A7 chord functioning like a dominant, this is actually a 4-6-5 chord, a harmonization of the melodic minor scale, and we would expect some type of dominant chord after this, which we typically get, and we get in this case D sharp, B, F sharp, and A, which is B7 over D sharp. That's a 5-6-5 chord. And then we get E minor, E, B, E, and G, which is our tonic triad in root position. Then we are presented with a modulation zone. I think that this is where we modulate to the key of G major. This is our 6 chord. And then we are in the key of G major to take us out to our last cadence, which is an implied perfect authentic cadence. The progression is there and the chorale feels like a cadence is happening. There just aren't any fermatas in the score, which makes me wonder why they don't occur. We then get naturalization of the melodic minor that we just had, C, C, E, and G. That's a root position C major triad, which is our 4 chord, passing 7th in the tenor. Kind of interesting, 6 going to 4. Definitely not a common progression, but we do see it from time to time in Bach. We then have D, A, D, and G. I think we know what's going on here. This G is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and what's being implied is a 5 chord here. And after this passing B here in the tenor, we get a resolution to the F sharp that also coincides with this C here. It's very similar to the way that we ended our previous system's last phrase, right? We ended with a 5-7 chord. 5-7 chords are, generally speaking, less common than 5 chords in cadential situations. We do see them from time to time, but I'm not going to throw numbers around, but definitely speaking, they are not as common. So the fact that we're seeing 5-7 chords used in both phrases makes me feel like that's just another point of comparison between the phrases in this particular chorale. And to take us out, our final cadence ends on the tonic triad, G, B, D, and G. It's G major, root position, and that's going to be today's analysis. I think the big takeaways from this chorale obviously are the unique sort of suspension figure. That's less of a takeaway of what makes this, what could make a chorale special, but more so an interesting injection of non-chorale texture into this particular piece. The minor dominant happening here is pretty interesting as well. But other than that, really fairly straightforward harmony. Not too difficult to analyze when you're sort of outside of this section. I definitely spent the majority of my time trying to make sense of what was going on here. I knew what I was hearing. I knew that I was hearing an implied progression, but I needed to put it on the paper, and putting it on the page was the challenging part, actually, because there are different ways we could interpret what was going on here. But I think that's pretty much all there is to talk about in this chorale. Definitely an unusual one. All in all, it's interesting, you know, it's fairly straightforward harmonically when there is a harmonic rhythm, and then you just throw something into the mix that seems completely off base, like what's going on here, and it actually ends up being something that could potentially be compared to the last phrase in terms of its structure and the way that it's related to the material earlier. But that's pretty much all I have to say. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well if you'd like to be notified of my daily upload, and feel free to like the video if you enjoyed the content. It just means that more people are going to see my videos, and that's helpful for me as a content creator. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.